Justice is supposed to be blind, but on a desolate, rain-slicked highway, it was about to be beaten, framed, and thrown in a cage. And the men holding the nightsticks had no idea they were arresting the very soul of the law itself. The night was a suffocating blanket of black, stitched with the silver threads of a relentless downpour. For the man standing beside the sputtering, 20-year-old sedan, the storm was a minor inconvenience. His thoughts were miles away with his ailing sister, the reason for this rare personal leave from a life of immense responsibility. He was a man of quiet dignity, whose gentle demeanor and stout frame were a deliberate camouflage. In his world, power was a tailored suit, a luxury car, a name that opened doors. He had all of that. A vast personal fortune built on decades of discipline and wise investments. But he chose none of it. He preferred this, a worn-out car, comfortable, plain clothes, and the simple peace of being overlooked. Anonymity was his sanctuary, a luxury no amount of money could buy. But tonight it would become his curse. The world exploded in a strobing blast of red and blue. The police cruiser seemed to materialize from the rain itself, its headlights pinning him like an insect. Two figures emerged, silhouettes against the blinding glare. The senior officer moved with the slow, deliberate swagger of a man who owned the ground he walked on. A cruel smirk was already playing on his lips, an air of untouchable arrogance radiating from him like heat. Behind him, his young partner followed, a shadow trying to mimic the substance of the man he followed. They didn't see a citizen in distress. They saw a target, a soft, easy mark. Well, well, look what the storm washed in. The senior officer's voice cut through the drumming rain, sharp and laced with contempt. He circled the old sedan, tapping a taillight with his baton. This junk heap finally give up on you, pal? The man by the car, a figure who commanded absolute respect in the state's most hallowed halls, remained silent. He simply watched, his mind a quiet storm of observation. He had spent a lifetime reading people, dissecting their motives from the witness stand, and he saw everything he needed to see in this officer's eyes. Boredom, a thirst for power, and a deep-seated cruelty. The officer's eyes raked over the man's stout frame. "Looks like you missed a few meals waiting for a tow truck," he sneered, getting a nervous chuckle from his partner. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot flush on the man's neck. He could have ended this with a single sentence, a name drop that would have made these officers snap to attention and apologize for the rest of their careers. But he didn't. He chose to observe, and that choice plunged him headfirst into a living nightmare. "Let's see what you've got in this rust bucket," the senior officer announced, his tone shifting from mockery to menace. He gestured for the man to step away. "Pop the doors." The man complied, his movements calm and measured. He watched as the officer began a rough, performative search, tossing papers from the glove compartment onto the damp passenger seat. Then he saw it. A movement so quick, so practiced, it was almost invisible. The officer's hand dipped into his own pocket and then reappeared, sliding under the driver's seat. A sleight of hand born of long, corrupt practice. A moment later, the officer stood up, holding a small plastic baggie containing a white powder. He held it up to the flashing lights with a triumphant grin. "Bingo! Looks like our boy here is in the distribution business." The man's heart didn't race. It sank, a cold, heavy stone dropping into the pit of his stomach. He saw the trap, perfectly sprung. He saw the falsified report already being written in the officer's mind. He saw the system he had dedicated his life to, the system he believed in despite its flaws, being twisted into a weapon right before his eyes. The cold, metallic click of handcuffs snapping around his wrists was the loudest sound he had ever heard. It was the sound of betrayal. The officers shoved him against the side of his own car, their roughness unnecessary, theatrical. Their laughter echoed in the night, swallowed by the storm. As they pushed him into the back of the cruiser, he made a critical choice. He would not speak his name. He would not call his high-powered lawyer. He would become the anonymous chubby man they saw him as. He had to see this through. He had to know just how deep the rot in this department went. He was no longer a man on his way to see his sister. He was evidence, a test case, descending into the belly of the beast he thought he commanded. The journey to the precinct was a blur of rain-streaked city lights and the rhythmic thump of windshield wipers, each sweep a tick of a clock counting down to his damnation. He sat in the back, hands cuffed behind him, the vinyl seat cold and slick. The officers in the front chatted about overtime and football, their voices a mundane soundtrack to the most extraordinary moment of his life. He wasn't a man anymore. He was cargo. A piece of paperwork waiting to be filed. He thought of his sister, her frail hand in his just a week ago, and a quiet, cold rage began to build beneath his calm exterior. It wasn't the explosive anger of a wronged man, but the slow, methodical fury of a master craftsman seeing his life's work being dismantled by vandals. The precinct was a shock to the senses. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee, cheap disinfectant, and human misery. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile, unforgiving glare on every scuffed floor tile and peeling paint chip. He was processed, not as a person, but as a statistic. His photo was taken, his fingerprints were inked, his belt and shoelaces were confiscated. Each step was a calculated stripping away of identity, designed to make him feel small, powerless, and guilty. The officers who processed him were indifferent, their movements rote and mechanical. To them, he was just another Tuesday night arrest. They didn't see the man who had built a personal fortune through shrewd investments, whose net worth in dollars, stocks, and other assets could have bought and sold this entire building. They saw a chubby, disheveled man in a cheap coat, and that was all that mattered. He was granted his one phone call. He stood before a grimy payphone bolted to the wall, a single officer watching him with bored suspicion. He didn't call the governor, a man he played golf with. He didn't call the top defense attorney in the state, whose number was on his speed dial. He called a number he knew by heart, the private line to his loyal and discreet court clerk, a man who had been with him for 30 years. The phone rang twice before it was picked up. "Hello?" A familiar, steady voice answered. The judge took a breath. "It's me," he said, his voice even. "I'm going to be delayed. The car had a problem. A significant one. I'm looking at a full engine rebuild." It was their code, a quiet alarm bell established years ago for a crisis he never thought would actually come. Engine rebuild meant he was in deep personal trouble and operating under a complete communications blackout. There was a pause on the other end, a silence so profound it was a shout. He could picture his clerk, Arthur, sitting up straight in his study, his mind already racing. "I understand," Arthur finally said, his voice clipped and professional, betraying nothing. "I'll adjust the schedule accordingly." The line went dead. The judge hung up the phone, the first and only move he could make on a chessboard where all his pieces had been taken. He was led to a holding cell and told he'd see a public defender in the morning. The hours crawled by on the back of a snail. He listened to the sounds of the jail, the distant clang of a steel door, the murmur of voices, a sudden desperate shout followed by silence. He was surrounded by the raw, unfiltered consequences of the system he presided over, and for the first time, he was seeing it from the bottom up. The next morning, a woman with tired eyes and a briefcase overflowing with files appeared at his cell. She introduced herself as his public defender. She looked at him with an expression of profound weariness, the look of a soldier who has fought too many losing battles. She saw a disheveled, overweight man in a hopeless situation. Another file to be processed, another life to be plea bargained away. "Look," she said, skipping the pleasantries, "the report is airtight. 2 officers, sworn testimony, physical evidence. They're offering a deal. Plead guilty to simple possession. You'll get probation, maybe some community service. You fight this, you're looking at serious time. It was the first crushing blow. The very system designed to defend him, the shield for the innocent, was presuming his guilt. It wasn't about justice, it was about clearing the docket. It was about efficiency. He looked at her, this overworked cog in a broken machine, and felt a pang of empathy mixed with disappointment. "I'm not guilty," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I won't be taking the plea." She sighed, a long, frustrated sound. She shuffled her papers, mistaking his integrity for foolish pride. "Suit yourself," she said, already mentally moving on to her next hopeless case. "But don't say I didn't warn you." Meanwhile, miles away, the senior officer was at his desk, typing up his official report. He added fabricated details with casual ease, embellishing the narrative to paint a picture of a suspicious, uncooperative suspect. He wrote that the man seemed nervous and evasive, that he kept looking around as if expecting someone. Each lie was another nail in the coffin, another brick in the wall of a corrupted system. He clicked "Submit," a self-satisfied smirk on his face, and went to get another cup of coffee, completely unaware that he had just declared war on the most powerful judge in the state. Across town, in a study lined with leather-bound books, Arthur hung up the phone, his hand trembling slightly. "Engine rebuild." The words echoed in the silent room, a coded SOS that chilled him to the bone. For 30 years, he had been Judge Albright's right hand, a silent partner in the administration of justice. He knew the judge not just as a superior, but as a man of profound integrity and quiet humility. He also knew about the judge's vast personal fortune, a portfolio of stocks, bonds, and real estate so extensive that the judge could have retired a billionaire decades ago. Instead, he chose public service. The idea of him being in any kind of trouble was absurd. The idea of him being in trouble so deep he needed the code was unthinkable. Arthur's mind, a finely tuned instrument of logic and procedure, immediately began to work. A public call for help was out of the question. It would compromise the judge's anonymity and potentially make things worse. This had to be handled with surgical precision. He turned to his computer, his fingers flying across the keyboard with a speed that belied his age. Using his high-level clearance, he accessed the state's central arrest database. He didn't know where the judge was, but he knew the make and model of that old sedan. He ran a search for any traffic incidents or arrests involving the vehicle in the last 24 hours. Seconds later, a result popped up. A single arrest on a deserted highway, miles from where the judge was supposed to be. The arresting officer's name was listed, Officer Miller. Arthur felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He cross-referenced the name, pulling up every case file Officer Miller had been involved in for the past 5 years. The screen began to fill with a disturbing pattern. Dozens of arrests, almost all for drug possession during routine traffic stops. And nearly every single one had ended the same way, with a quick plea bargain from a defendant represented by a public defender. It was a factory assembly line of convictions. Too clean, too efficient. Arthur leaned back, the screen's glow reflecting in his glasses. This wasn't a random incident. This was a system. Back in the holding cell, the judge was coming to the same conclusion. He sat on the cold metal bench, a silent observer in a world he had only ever seen from a distance. The air was thick with the stories of broken men. He listened as a young man in the corner, arrested for shoplifting, talked about his previous run-in with the law. "It was that cop, Miller," the young man said, his voice a mix of fear and resentment. "Pulled me over for a busted taillight. Next thing I know, he's finding a baggie under my seat. Same trick he pulled on my cousin last year. You can't fight it. Public defender just tells you to take the deal. It's his business model." The words hit the judge with the force of a physical blow. A business model. This wasn't just corruption. It was enterprise, a cynical, soul-crushing machine that fed on the poor and the powerless, turning them into statistics to boost an officer's career and clear a prosecutor's docket. His personal humiliation transformed into a righteous, glacial anger. He wasn't just fighting for his own freedom anymore. He was fighting for every person who had been caught in this web, every life ruined by a sleight of hand on a dark highway. His public defender, meanwhile, was about to close his file for the day. She saw him as just another client in denial, another man whose pride would cost him years of his life. But as she reached for the folder, a flicker of professionalism, a tiny ember of the idealist she once was, made her pause. She scanned the arresting officer's report one last time. Her eyes, trained by years of sifting through bureaucratic lies, caught it, a tiny, almost imperceptible flaw. The timestamp on Officer Miller's sworn statement listed the arrest at 11:42 p.m., but the vehicle impound report, filed by a different department, logged the judge's car as received at 11:50 p.m. at a lot that was a 20-minute drive from the scene of the arrest. It was impossible, a small detail, the kind most would overlook. But for her, it was a loose thread on a perfectly woven tapestry of lies. A spark of curiosity, an emotion she hadn't felt in years, was ignited. She straightened up, a new energy coursing through her. For the first time, she considered the possibility that this disheveled, stubborn man was actually telling the truth. She immediately drafted a formal discovery request, her first move in a real fight. She asked for everything: personnel files, previous complaints against the officer, and most importantly, the patrol car's dash cam and body cam footage. The response came back with insulting speed. The personnel files were heavily redacted, the complaints were sealed, and the video footage, a single, infuriating line typed at the bottom of the page, unavailable due to a convenient and irreparable technical malfunction. She stared at the words, her blood running cold. This wasn't a stone wall, it was a fortress, and she realized with a sinking heart that she wasn't just fighting a single corrupt cop. She was fighting the entire department that protected him. For a moment, the sheer scale of the conspiracy threatened to crush her. The weight of it was a physical pressure in her chest, making it hard to breathe. For years, she had operated within the system, accepting its flaws as unfortunate but necessary evils. Now she saw it for what it was, a machine designed to protect its own, even at the cost of innocent lives. The old, cynical part of her screamed to drop the case, to file it away with the hundreds of others and move on. But the face of her quiet, stubborn client floated in her mind, his unwavering insistence on his innocence. It wasn't pride she'd seen in his eyes, it was truth. The decision she made in that quiet, cluttered office was a turning point, not just for the case, but for her life. She would fight, even if it meant fighting alone. Her first step was to deliver a message. During her next visit with the judge, she passed him a folded note, pretending it was a list of legal questions. The note was from Arthur, a single, devastating sentence delivered through a discreet channel she didn't fully understand. As the judge read the words, his calm facade, the one that had held firm through the arrest and the indignities of the jail, finally cracked, not with a shout, but with a terrifying stillness. His sister had taken a turn for the worse, a severe decline. The doctors weren't optimistic. The words blurred on the page. His fight was no longer an abstract battle for the soul of justice. It was now a desperate, frantic race against time. He needed to be with her. The system that had stolen his freedom was now threatening to steal his final moments with the person he loved most in the world. A cold, quiet rage, purer and harder than any emotion he had ever felt, settled deep in his bones. It was the rage of a man with nothing left to lose. While the judge wrestled with his grief and fury, his clerk, Arthur, was unearthing the foundations of the fortress they were up against. His investigation into Officer Miller had led him down a rabbit hole of shell corporations and real estate holdings. He discovered that Miller's family wasn't just comfortable, they were a dynasty of local power, their wealth quietly managed through savvy investments and political influence. Arthur, who managed the judge's own considerable personal fortune, a vast portfolio of stocks, real estate, and other assets that made him a quiet multimillionario, recognized the patterns of protected capital. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place when he found a name recurring in public records and land deeds connected to Miller's family. A powerful city councilman who just happened to oversee the police budget and, more importantly, the Internal Affairs Division. Officer Miller wasn't just a corrupt cop. He was the nephew of the very man tasked with policing the police. The corruption wasn't a bug in the system. It was a feature, insulated by a firewall of political power and family ties. Unaware of this political dimension, but armed with the unshakable proof of the timeline discrepancy, the public defender requested a meeting with the district attorney. She walked into his opulent, wood-paneled office, feeling a flicker of hope. She was a defense attorney, but they were all officers of the court, weren't they? Surely the DA would care about fabricated evidence. She laid out her case calmly and logically, pointing to the impossible timestamps in the reports and the convenient malfunction of the dashcam. The DA, a man with a politician's smile and a shark's eyes, listened patiently. When she was finished, he leaned back in his leather chair and laughed. It wasn't a kind laugh. It was a sound of pure, dismissive contempt. "A fantasy," he said, shaking his head. "You're chasing a fantasy, counselor. Officer Miller is a decorated hero. You, on the other hand, are a public defender whose contract is up for review next month." The threat, though veiled, was as clear as a blade to her throat. "I'd advise you to focus on cases you can actually win. Persuade your client to take the deal. It's the best thing for everyone." She walked out of his office, the sound of his laughter echoing in her ears. The hope she had felt was gone, replaced by a chilling certainty. She was utterly and completely alone, fighting not just a cop or a department, but a unified front of corruption that reached the highest levels of the city's power structure. She returned to her cramped office, the grand, mocking space of the district attorney's suite, feeling worlds away. Despair was a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders, making her feel small and insignificant. Every instinct screamed at her to retreat, to take the DA's advice and salvage what was left of her career. She could just tell her client the deal was the only option. He'd refuse, she'd file the motion, and the system would grind him into dust. It wouldn't be her fault. It was how things worked. But as she sat there, surrounded by towers of files representing other lost causes, the judge's quiet, unyielding dignity refused to leave her mind. She had spent years watching guilty men proclaim their innocence. This was different. This was a man whose belief in his own truth was so absolute it felt like a law of nature. To betray that would be to betray the last shred of idealism she had left. Just as the weight of her solitude became unbearable, a shadow fell across the frosted glass of her office door. She looked up startled, but saw no one in the hallway. When she glanced down, she saw it. A small, white envelope had been slipped underneath the door. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Was it a threat? A warning from the DA to back off? With trembling hands, she picked it up. There was no name, no return address. She tore it open. Inside was a single folded piece of paper. On it, one word was typed in stark black ink. Dinah. There was no signature, no explanation. Just that single, cryptic word. It could be a trap. It could be a cruel joke. But it was also the first thing that hadn't come from the official, corrupted channels. It was a crack in the fortress wall. Following it was a risk, but doing nothing was a guaranteed loss. That night, She drove to the location of the arrest, her headlights cutting through the darkness. A short distance down the road, just as the highway began to merge back into civilization, was a lone 24-hour diner, its neon sign a lonely beacon in the night. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of coffee and fried food. A few truckers sat at the counter, their faces illuminated by their phones. A young waitress with tired eyes and a haunted expression was wiping down a booth. The public defender slid into the booth and ordered a coffee. When the waitress brought it over, the lawyer looked at her directly. "I'm an attorney," she said, keeping her voice low. "I'm investigating an arrest that happened out on the highway a few weeks ago. A man in an old sedan." The waitress froze. The coffee pot in her hand trembled, sloshing hot liquid onto the saucer. Fear, stark and primal, washed over her face. She glanced nervously toward the counter. I can't talk about that," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He comes in here. Officer Miller. He's a regular." She leaned in closer, her fear mingling with a desperate need to speak. "He told us all. He said people who see things they shouldn't, who talk too much, they have accidents. Their families have bad luck." The waitress pulled back, her eyes pleading. "I have a little boy. I can't." The public defender's blood ran cold. It wasn't just corruption. It was intimidation, a pattern of terror woven into the fabric of this small community. She left the diner with a name, but no testimony, a witness too terrified to speak. Yet, the anonymous note now made sense. Someone on the inside was trying to help. The news that the public defender was still poking around reached Officer Miller quickly. The network of informants he had built through fear and favors worked efficiently. He felt a prickle of annoyance, which quickly curdled into genuine concern. This should have been over. A simple plea bargain, another easy mark. But this stubborn public defender and her silent, chubby client were becoming a problem. He couldn't afford a real investigation. His entire career, the comfortable life it afforded him, was built on a foundation of these quick, dirty convictions. He decided it was time to end it, to fabricate a piece of evidence so damning that no jury would ever acquit. He took the audio from his body cam, the part where he was mocking the judge, and spent hours in his basement using cheap software to clumsily edit it. He spliced in words and phrases from the judge's few, quiet responses, twisting them into a new toxic narrative. The result was a garbled, static-filled recording where the judge appeared to be offering a bribe. "I have considerable assets," the doctored audio now said. "A man with my capital can make this go away. Just name the price." It was poorly done, a clear fake to any trained ear, but to a jury and a friendly judge, it would be a kill shot. Armed with his new evidence, Miller went straight to the DA. The charges were immediately escalated. The judge was no longer just a suspect in a minor drug case. He was now accused of attempting to bribe a police officer, a serious felony that carried a mandatory prison sentence. The system was closing in on him from all sides. To seal his fate, the DA made a special request. The case was fast-tracked and assigned to the courtroom of Judge Wallace, a man notorious for his unwavering pro-police bias. A hanging judge who saw public defenders as an inconvenience and defendants as guilty until proven otherwise. All avenues of escape, it seemed, were now completely and irrevocably cut off. The news of the escalated charges and the assignment to Judge Wallace's court landed like a death sentence. The public defender felt the last of her fighting spirit drain away, leaving a hollow ache of failure. She had tried, she had pushed against the wall, and the wall had simply pushed back harder. She met with her client in the sterile, grey interview room, the air thick with unspoken despair. She explained the new charges, the doctored audio, the judge they were facing. She expected him to break, to finally show fear or anger. Instead, he just listened, his expression unreadable, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the concrete walls. "My sister," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Is there any way, any legal maneuver to get a continuance? A delay?" She shook her head, the motion feeling heavy, final. "They fast-tracked it for a reason. They want this over. With the bribery charge, no judge in this district would grant bail, let alone a continuance. I'm sorry. We're out of moves." He closed his eyes for a long moment. He thought of his life's work, the careful accumulation not just of a vast personal fortune through savvy investments in stocks and real estate, but of a reputation for unassailable integrity. He had built a legacy on the principle that the law was a shield for all. Now that shield was being used as a club to beat him into submission, and the immense capital he commanded, the dollars and assets that could buy influence anywhere else, were utterly useless. Here, he was just a number, a file, a conviction waiting to happen. The only asset that mattered was his character, and they were in the process of systematically destroying it. The days leading up to the trial were a blur of grim preparation. The public defender went through the motions, drafting arguments she knew Judge Wallace would ignore, preparing cross-examinations for witnesses who would lie under oath. It felt like arranging deck chairs on the Titanic. Her only sliver of hope was the anonymous note. The junior officer. He was the only wild card in a stacked deck. But he had gone silent. He was too scared. And she couldn't blame him. She was scared too. The day of the trial arrived, dawning grey and merciless. The courtroom was an old, imposing chamber with dark wood paneling and portraits of stern-faced judges from generations past staring down from the walls. The air was heavy, not with the solemnity of justice, but with the suffocating certainty of a foregone conclusion. Officer Miller sat at the prosecution's table, looking crisp and confident in his dress uniform, a smug smirk playing on his lips. He exchanged a knowing glance with the district attorney, who was shuffling papers with the relaxed air of a man about to secure an easy win. Judge Wallace entered, a bull of a man who settled into his high-backed chair with a thud that seemed to shake the room. He scanned the courtroom with an expression of bored impatience, his eyes gliding over the defendant without a flicker of interest. The public defender felt her hands grow cold and clammy. This wasn't a court of law. It was an abattoir. The trial began, and it was a brutal, efficient demolition. The DA called Officer Miller to the stand, who recounted his fabricated story with polished sincerity. He painted a picture of a routine stop that turned into a major drug bust, portraying himself as a vigilant hero and the defendant as a shifty, dangerous criminal. The public defender's objections were swatted away by Judge Wallace with a wave of his hand, often before she could even finish her sentence. Then came the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, the doctored audio recording. The court clerk played the file, and a distorted, static-filled voice filled the room. "Considerable assets. A man with my capital can make this go away. Just name the price." It was a clumsy fake, full of awkward cuts and unnatural pauses, but in the context of the trial, in a courtroom presided over by a biased judge, it was devastating. The jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Officer Miller looked on with an expression of pained virtue, as if reliving a deep personal insult. The DA rested his case, his face a mask of triumph. He had not just presented evidence, he had orchestrated a performance, and Judge Wallace was his most appreciative audience. The public defender felt a wave of nausea. She had nothing, no witness, no evidence, no hope. The waitress was too terrified to testify. The junior officer was a ghost. All she had was her client. "The defense calls one witness," she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the silence. "The defendant." A murmur went through the courtroom. It was a risky, often foolish move for a defendant to take the stand. Judge Wallace leaned forward, a flicker of cruel amusement in his eyes. This should be entertaining. The bailiff unlocked the defendant's handcuffs and motioned for him to approach the witness stand. He moved with a slow, deliberate calm, his worn suit looking out of place in the polished wooden box. He placed his hand on the Bible, his eyes not on the clerk or the book, but sweeping across the room, taking in the jury, the sneering officer, the smug DA, and the impatient judge on the bench. He took the oath, his voice steady and clear, and then he sat down. The entire weight of the corrupt system was now focused on him, a single, unassuming man about to speak his truth to a world that had already decided he was a liar. The public defender asked her first question, her voice trembling slightly. "Sir, please state your name for the record." He looked at her, then turned his gaze back to the courtroom. He did not answer the question directly. Instead, he began to speak, his voice quiet yet carrying to every corner of the room. "There is an oath," he began, "that every person in this room in a position of authority has taken. A promise not to a superior, not to a political party, but to the law itself. It is a sacred trust, a belief that the scales of justice are held steady, that the badge is a symbol of protection, and the robe a symbol of impartiality." The DA shifted in his seat, annoyed. Officer Miller smirked, shaking his head at the man's pathetic attempt at a philosophical defense. Judge Wallace leaned forward, his face a thundercloud of impatience. "Answer the question, witness," he boomed. "This is a courtroom, not a lecture hall." The man on the stand ignored him, his eyes locking onto the jury. "We place our faith in this system. We believe that when a man is in trouble, the system will help him. When he is accused, it will presume his innocence. It is the bedrock of our society. But what happens?" He paused, his voice dropping. "When the system itself becomes the criminal, when the protectors become the predators." "That's enough!" Judge Wallace slammed his gavel down. "Counselor, control your witness, or I will hold you both in contempt." At that moment, the public defender rose from her seat. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with a newfound fire. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and steady. "The defense has a motion." Judge Wallace scoffed. "A motion? A little late for that, wouldn't you say? What is it?" "The defense moves for the presiding judge to recuse himself from this case," she announced. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. It was a shocking, career-ending move. To accuse a sitting judge of bias in his own courtroom was unheard of. The DA shot to his feet, sputtering in outrage. Officer Miller's smug expression finally faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion. Judge Wallace's face turned a deep, dangerous shade of purple. "On what grounds, Counselor?" he roared, his voice shaking with fury. "You are on thin ice. On what possible grounds could you base such an outrageous, insulting, and frankly insane motion?" Whereas the public defender took a deep breath. This was the moment, the point of no return. She turned not to the judge, but to her client on the witness stand. The room fell into a dead, absolute silence, every eye fixed on her. "The grounds, Your Honor," she said, her voice ringing with a power no one in that room had ever heard from her before, "is a profound and undisclosed conflict of interest." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. "The court will now hear from the Honorable Judge Arthur Albright, Chief Circuit Judge of this state's Superior Court." If a bomb had gone off, the effect could not have been more explosive. For a second there was nothing, just a silent, collective processing of an impossible reality. Then the shockwave hit. The district attorney's jaw fell open, his face turning the color of ash. The pen in Officer Miller's hand clattered to the floor as all the blood drained from his face, his confident smirk replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. On the bench, Judge Wallace froze, his hand clutching his gavel, his eyes wide with a dawning horror so profound it seemed to stop his heart. They had not been prosecuting a random, chubby man in a worn-out suit. They had arrested, humiliated, and framed their own superior, the most powerful, most respected, and most unassailable judicial figure in the entire region, a man who had been on a 1-month, officially sanctioned personal leave of absence. Arthur Albright now looked directly at the man on the bench who, just moments before, had been his judge and jury. The quiet humility was gone, replaced by an aura of absolute authority that radiated from him like a physical force. His voice, when he spoke again, was no longer that of a defendant. It was the voice of the law itself. "Judge Wallace," he said, the name a cold, hard stone in the silent room, "you will remain on that bench until I am finished. You will listen." It was not a request. It was a command. He then turned his attention to the DA's table. "Officer Miller," he said, his eyes like chips of ice, "you testified under oath that I seemed nervous and evasive. The truth is, I was observing the practiced ease with which you planted a bag of narcotics in my vehicle. A sleight of hand you have clearly perfected over many years and dozens of victims." He continued, systematically dismantling every lie, every piece of fabricated evidence. The prosecution presented an audio recording, a clumsy fake, suggesting I attempted to bribe the officer. They claimed I spoke of my capital and assets as a means to corrupt him. Let me be clear, the vast personal fortune I have accumulated through decades of sound investments, the stocks, the real estate, the entire patrimony is irrelevant here. What is relevant is that the only crime committed that night was by the man wearing the badge, who perjured himself on this stand today. The edifice of corruption, built on fear and silence, began to crumble. In the back of the courtroom, a young man in a police uniform, Officer Miller's partner, suddenly stood up, his face streaked with tears. "He's telling the truth," the junior officer cried out, his voice cracking. "All of it. I saw him plant the drugs. I saw it all." The confession shattered the last vestiges of the conspiracy. As if on cue, the courtroom doors swung open. Two stoic, grim-faced men in dark suits entered, federal marshals, alerted by Arthur's loyal clerk the moment the trial began. The waitress from the diner, who had been brought in and kept in a witness protection room, stood up from the public gallery, her voice trembling but clear. "He's right. I saw the whole thing from the diner window. The officer put something in his car." The climax was as swift as it was absolute. The federal marshals walked directly to the prosecution's table. They didn't stop, their steps echoing in the stunned silence of the room. One marshal placed a firm hand on Officer Miller's shoulder, while the other stood behind the district attorney. "Sir, you are under arrest for conspiracy, fabrication of evidence, and perjury," the first marshal said, his voice calm and devoid of emotion. Miller, who had been a predator in this ecosystem just minutes before, now looked like cornered prey, his eyes wide with disbelief and terror. The DA began to bluster. "On whose authority?" But the words died in his throat as the second marshal produced a pair of handcuffs. The metallic click as they were secured around his wrists was the sound of an entire corrupt enterprise collapsing in on itself. At the same time, another court official approached the bench where Judge Wallace sat, frozen, a statue of impotent rage. "Judge Wallace," the official said quietly but firmly, "you are hereby suspended from the bench, pending immediate impeachment proceedings and a full investigation by the Judicial Review Board." Wallace didn't respond. He simply stared at Judge Albright, the man he had tried to destroy, who now sat not in the witness box, but as the embodiment of the very justice Wallace had so thoroughly mocked. The gavel, the symbol of his power, lay useless before him. Weeks later, the wood-paneled chambers of the chief circuit judge felt different. The room, once a sanctuary of quiet contemplation, now felt like a command center in a war that was far from over. Judge Arthur Albright sat behind his large mahogany desk, not in his judicial robes, but in a simple shirt, his sleeves rolled up. Spread before him were not case files, but drafts for sweeping systemic reform. He was creating a new, fully independent civilian oversight committee with the power to investigate police misconduct. A proposal that was already sending shockwaves through the city's political establishment. He wasn't celebrating. There was no joy in this victory, only the heavy, profound weight of responsibility. He had seen the belly of the beast, and the image was seared into his memory. His ordeal had shown him that his vast personal fortune, the carefully managed investments and assets that made him a multi-millionario, meant nothing in a system designed to crush those without a voice. The real poverty was not a lack of money, but a lack of power. His victory wasn't in punishing his tormentors, but in earning the chance to begin healing the institution he had almost lost faith in. There was a soft knock on his door. "Come in," he said. The public defender entered. She looked different too. The weariness was gone from her eyes, replaced by a clear, focused sense of purpose. She carried herself with a newfound confidence. "Judge," she said, her voice respectful but not deferential. They were colleagues now, soldiers who had been in the trenches together. "Please," he said, gesturing to the chair opposite him. "I believe you've seen the proposal I'm putting forward." She nodded. "It's ambitious. It's necessary. It's going to be a battle. Which is why I need the best fighters on my team," Albright replied, looking at her directly. "I'm offering you the position of lead counsel for the new oversight committee. You'll have full autonomy and the resources to pursue justice wherever it leads." Tears welled in her eyes, but she did not let them fall. For years, she had fought for scraps of justice in a broken system. Now, she was being handed a sword to help rebuild it. Her faith, so close to being extinguished, had been reignited by the quiet integrity of the man in front of her. I accept," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." After she left, Judge Albright stood and walked to the large window overlooking the city. His victory had been absolute, but it had come at a cost. He was no longer the unassuming man who found comfort in anonymity. He had been forced to wield his power, and in doing so, had changed himself. The fire he had felt in that jail cell had not been extinguished. It had been forged into a tool, a weapon for reform. He picked up his coat from the back of his chair. It was time to go. He walked out of the courthouse, not to his old sputtering sedan, but to a simple, clean car driven by a court-appointed security detail, a new necessity. He wasn't going home to his quiet life. He was going to the hospital. He was finally going to sit by his sister's bedside. She was recovering, the doctors now said, her resilience surprising them all. It was as if she had been waiting for him. As the car pulled away from the grand stone building, he knew his life of quiet anonymity was over. He had endured the fire of the system's darkest corners and had emerged not unscathed, but stronger, reforged with a purpose clearer and more urgent than ever before. Justice was meant to protect him, but on that rain-drenched highway, it became a trap, twisted, weaponized, and turned against the very man sworn to uphold it. As the storm hammered the pavement, 2 officers pulled over a broken-down sedan and found not a criminal, but the most powerful judge in the state, hidden behind plain clothes and a quiet demeanor. They mocked him, planted evidence, and snapped the cuffs with the arrogance of men who believed no one was watching. They didn't know his name, they didn't know his power, and they had no idea that their midnight cruelty would ignite a war, one that would expose a fortress of corruption and shake the entire justice system to its core. The car moved silently through the city streets, a stark contrast to the clanging chaos of the jail cell that had been his home for a month. Each passing building was a monument to the world he had almost lost, the society whose laws he was sworn to uphold. He wasn't just looking at a city. He was seeing the people the law was meant to protect, and for the first time he understood the fragility of that protection on a visceral level. He arrived at the hospital and walked through the quiet, sterile corridors. The scent of antiseptic cleaner replaced the smell of despair that had clung to him. He stopped outside his sister's room, taking a deep breath before pushing the door open. She was sitting up in bed, looking pale, but with a familiar light in her eyes. A book lay open on her lap. She looked up as he entered, and a slow, beautiful smile spread across her face. "I knew you'd come," she said, her voice a little weak but clear. He crossed the room in 3 strides and took her hand, his own large hand enveloping hers. Words failed him. The entire legal battle, the fight against corruption, the cold rage, it all melted away in the simple, profound warmth of her touch. This was what he had been fighting for. Not an abstract principle of justice, but for this, for family, for the moments that truly mattered. "How are you?" he finally managed to ask, his voice thick. "Stubborn," she replied with a twinkle in her eye. "Like my brother. The doctors are baffled. I just told them I had things to wait for." He sat with her for hours, the city lights beginning to glitter outside the window. They didn't talk about the trial, the arrest, or the darkness he had waded through. They talked about their childhood, about old memories, about the future. In the quiet peace of that hospital room, he felt the last of the bitterness wash away, leaving only the hard, clear stone of his new resolve. He understood now that his old life of quiet comfort was a luxury, one bought with the naive belief that the system he served was self-correcting. He now knew it was a living thing, a garden that required constant, vigilant tending, lest the weeds of corruption choke out the light. His immense personal wealth, his carefully curated portfolio of stocks and other assets had been utterly powerless to shield him. His true capital had been his character, and the loyalty of the few good people who still believed in the system's promise. His fight was not over. It had just begun. The reforms he was proposing would be a war of attrition against entrenched power. But looking at his sister, her hand resting peacefully in his, he felt no fear. He had faced down the worst the system could throw at him and had won. He was no longer just a judge interpreting the law. He was a survivor, a witness, and a warrior for the justice that every citizen deserved. His purpose was no longer written in law books, but etched onto his soul. He had been tested in the fire, and he had become the flame. If this story of justice and integrity resonated with you, please show your support by hitting the like button. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories, and don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. What part of the judge's journey moved you the most? We look forward to reading your responses. Thank you for watching.